I promise to begin discussions about real problems that will be faced when colonizing Mars. This video about the problem with the red planet's CO2 atmosphere is the first of these videos. In essence, having so much CO2 in Mars's atmosphere means that humans will never be able to walk around on the red planet's surface without protective gear, unless some kind of over-the-horizon technologies can be developed. I will get to the latter point at the end of the video. For now, however, let's start by looking at Mars' CO2 reality. Even though Mars's atmosphere is only about 1% of that of Earth, it is mostly composed of CO2. If, by some miracle, humans could thicken Mars's atmosphere to levels like those on Earth with gases other than CO2, that 1% of CO2, again approximating, would be 10,000 parts per million. If you consider that currently the CO2 in our atmosphere is about 420 parts per million, and that CO2 is virtually as poisonous as carbon monoxide to humans, you can see why, Houston, we have a problem, and that problem is CO2. Further exacerbating this issue is that most of the gases to thicken Mars's atmosphere during terraforming will be CO2. Thus, the red planet's future atmospheric makeup can hardly be expected to be less than 80 to 90% CO2. To re-emphasize the point, this kind of atmosphere would be deadly to humans and most higher forms of animal life without either breathing apparatuses or genetic reprogramming. Some of the CO2 can be converted to oxygen, of course, by plants during photosynthesis. This, however, hardly gives hope for a real solution to the CO2 issues. On the one hand, if you were able to convert much of the CO2 into O2, you run the risk of having extreme fire hazards on Mars. On Earth, our atmosphere is about 21% oxygen. As you elevate the oxygen levels above this 21%, fire becomes increasingly likely. NASA found this out in 1967, when 3 of its astronauts died during training, breathing pure oxygen in their replica space capsule. So, unless you want to fear every odd spark on Mars touching off a firestorm, you cannot have your oxygen content much above 21%. Again, we have not much dealt with the CO2 issue on Mars by converting some of the CO2 to oxygen. Nitrogen, making up about 78% of our atmosphere, may be in short supply on Mars. At some point in the future, Martian colonists might decide to move a nitrogen-rich comet to the red planet. If they can move the comet and somehow burn it up in the atmosphere without crashing it into Mars's surface, they again might be able to vastly increase the nitrogen levels in the atmosphere. Even this, however, might only reduce the CO2 levels somewhat. I suppose you could bring in comets repeatedly and perhaps have some kind of nitrogen, CO2 and oxygen mix, but this would not be able to get that CO2 level down below the 10,000 parts per million discussed above, and nowhere near the 1,000 to 5,000 parts per million level that humans could tolerate over the medium to long term. As with most things, getting 90% to a goal usually costs half the price. Getting that last 10% costs the other half. So as for CO2 on Mars, unlike in horseshoes and hand grenades, close is not good enough. Thus, it would seem human colonists on Mars need to content themselves with the idea that the atmosphere on their new world will contain levels of CO2 poisonous to our current physiology, maybe for a long time, maybe forever. So, while the climate on Mars could be adjusted by terraforming to be warm, and rain and snow could fall, going outside without a breathing apparatus would be fatal. In the near future, human colonists might go outside in shirt sleeves and sunglasses, since the planet's air pressure would not boil away their blood, but they would need to wear something that either provided a breathable atmosphere or a device that filtered out 99% of the CO2 while allowing sufficient oxygen for humans to breathe during these surface excursions. I'm not sure whether this latter idea is possible with today's technology in a small device, or how safe such a small device might be. Likely it will be possible at some point in the near future, but that too is a kind of breathing device. The more long-term solution for Mars is for some kind of genetic modifications to humans and animals on the planet's surface that would allow us and them to breathe the red planet's atmosphere. I do not pretend to know details about biology or the exact mechanism of CO2 and carbon monoxide poisoning, but the basics are that these molecules bind to hemoglobin in the blood that blocks the transport of oxygen being transported to the cells in our bodies. As we live and learn on Mars, no doubt we will learn of other deleterious biological effects of the CO2 and carbon monoxide, but it is the lack of oxygen that will kill us quickly. I suspect that genetically modifying human and animal hemoglobin to allow the binding of oxygen and deny the binding of the poisons would be both difficult and controversial. I also suspect, however, that it could be done, and that humans on Mars would be willing to undergo such modification to avoid the hassles of wearing breathing apparatuses every time they stepped outside. Surely this would be done for the animal species destined to populate the Martian surface. For those whose real interest in Mars is how to terraform the planet, I do not doubt that the climate there could be made pleasant for humans. The real challenge will be to design and execute plans to create a biome on Mars that is both sustainable for the species that live there and does not create a rabbit problem such as exists in Australia. Rabbits are everywhere because there were no natural predators of rabbits as a species gets released onto Mars's surface. Of course, not only would each species need to be examined to ensure it could live on Mars's surface, but mammals and perhaps other types of animals would also likely need to be genetically modified. Talk about a never-ending project. The research into animal hemoglobin and oxygen transport in these animals will no doubt pave the way for possible solutions for the CO2 problems affecting humans. As I have stated in many of these videos, Mars is the only place in the solar system where life could be lived much like lives humans live on Earth. The problems I have laid out here about CO2 can likely be solved, and I doubt I will change my mind unless I had a great deal of extra evidence. There are other issues that I will discuss that, in my mind, are much more problematic to the claim that life on Mars could resemble life on Earth. Among these are the issues of low gravity, especially as it affects the growth of fetuses, etc. The problem of radiation, the problem of teenagers wanting to leave a cold, desert planet in the age of the internet, and, related to the problem of low gravity, the issue of loss of bone density and muscle mass. While I can propose solutions to all of these problems, and I will lay out these problems and possible solutions in other videos, only time and experience will tell. Or it may be that future Martians will not care one bit that life on their beloved Mars does not resemble the life humans lead on Earth.